guys, it's Trina, and today I want to do more of a discussion video about something that's been on my mind recently with some of the books that I've been reading. I have a lot of ideas for discussion videos, but I never really feel quite prepared to do them, and I don't feel prepared today, and I don't script my videos, so we're gonna see how this goes. But this is a discussion, so I definitely want to hear what you guys think of this. And the thing I've been thinking about lately is cultural relativism and how this relates to historical fiction and fantasy worlds. So what it's a tongue twister, guys. Cultural relativism is this idea that exists within the field of anthropology. Anthropology is the study of societies and people, civilizations. What do we have in common from today's type of civilization to civilizations that we've seen all throughout history? And within the study of different civilizations, although there are things that are the same throughout all time periods, throughout all people groups, there's also this idea of cultural relativism, which is the idea that you cannot judge someone in one society based on the standards of a totally different society. I have not studied anthropology, so if I get these terms wrong, give me a little bit of grace with that, but I have looked into this throughout the past year and a half as I've been reading historical fiction and fantasy novels. The way in which it influences how I read is what I'm really talking about here. Let me give you an example of cultural relativism, and this is going to be quite an extreme example to kind of just drive home the point because there's a lot of gray area in this, obviously. But say we today are studying a culture that existed thousands of years ago, and we find out that all of the men in that civilization, when the men were in their 20s or 30s, they were taking wives that were 12 years old. Now, by today's standards, which this is 2016 and I live in the United States, this is something that would be considered gross or wrong and in fact illegal. However, when you look into that civilization, you would discover, well, that was thousands of years ago. They don't have the same laws that we have today, and that group of people actually lived in a place where all the women were dying really early. So the men had no choice but to take very young wives, and so women were reproducing at a very young age. They were hitting puberty earlier because that's just what the effects of that civilization were. The idea of cultural relativism is that a person's actions and lifestyle can only be judged within the civilization that they live in. So I, in a totally different situation, cannot judge that person's lifestyle as wrong or worse than mine because that was just their normal, That was just their way of life. It's the same way as if somebody in the year 3000 looks back on my culture and is like, ooh, you guys drink tap water and you guys still use toilets? That is so gross and primitive. But to me, indoor plumbing is one of the greatest innovations of my time, and it's such a luxury. But in the future, who knows what that's going to be looking like. Cultural relativism in reading, with what I take into account as a reader, usually has to do with historical fiction, books that are set in a different time period than mine. I have to understand that that way of life may not look good based on my standards of living. The books I'm actually reading right now that are really bringing this to mind is the Outlander series by Diana Gabaldon. This is book one. I'm currently reading the second book in this series, and what this is about, if you haven't read it yet, this is about a woman that lives in the 1940s, and she is transported back in time to the 1740s, and she finds herself living with a Scottish clan. She finds herself faced with very different ways of life, things that she is uncomfortable with. In Outlander, we follow a character that is supposed to be a hero. We are supposed to be rooting for this person, and he is actually forced to beat his wife because the traditions of this clan back in the 1700s were that if a woman puts the entire clan in danger, she must be punished, and the way in which they punish their women is by beating them. And while he is not happy doing this, while he tries to resist as best as he can, he still goes through it, and this is reasoned away in the book as, I had no choice, I had to do it, this is just how we do things here. The main character that is from the 1900s does actually struggle with that, so we see through her eyes how wrong it is, but then she comes to understand, and the reader is supposed to come to understand, but that's just a way of the time. So can I sit here reading this in modern day and judge oh, that's wrong? I can think it's wrong. I can think that that character's actions are undesirable and wrong, and I can completely dislike what has happened, but I do have an understanding of cultural relativism. That's just how things are to them. So to him, that's just a normal way of life. However, cultural relativism for me only goes so far. In book 2, we have the same heroic figure who constantly threatens rape or who constantly is threatening, physical abuse. And at this point I'm like, I get it, that's your way of life, but I just don't enjoy this. So, this is me just exploring the idea of, I'm not saying that cultural relativism means that you have to like a book just because that's relative to their culture. I just mean that I can to some extent see that and overlook something as being historically accurate, as being relative to that time period. It's something I don't enjoy reading about myself. As much as I can appreciate cultural relativism and see it and examine this in books, I am also of the opinion, a lot of times, my opinions conflict with each other from day to day. I am also of the opinion that in a case like Outlander, as accurate as it should be, as good of a sign of a well-constructed story that is, it's also not nonfiction, and I don't need it to be completely 100% accurate to that time period, because I do think that books and authors should take into account a modern audience. Who are they writing this book for? Who do they want to get something out of it? Do they want the guy from the 1700s who values raping and pillaging and beating his wife to read that book and see himself reflected in it? If that's what they're writing for, they'd better find a time machine, because chances are they're writing for a modern audience who would be uncomfortable with some of those things and does need to see some balance brought to that type of a setting. When a book is showing cultural norms that are very different than ours, I do think it is critical for them to include an observer character. And I don't know if that is a real thing, that's kind of how I just think about characters in books like this. And Outlander does have the observer character. That is the character of Claire. She's the main character who narrates the book, and we see through her eyes. She's from the 1940s, which is much closer to our time period. So her ideas and standards of living are a little bit closer to ours. So she can offer balance to the situation by seeing the way in which the 1700s men act and saying, whoa, that's not okay, because I'm used to something totally different. As much balance as I felt like she brought to book 1, I still feel like this series could do a much better job by portraying the darker and grittier sides of that type of historic lifestyle through villainous characters, instead of almost always being portrayed through the main hero that we are supposed to be rooting for. I also look at fantasy worlds in terms of cultural relativism, and I have a good example that I think is a good example because I've recently read the sequel to this one, but that is A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas. This book takes place in a fantasy world about fae, and we see these fae acting in very different ways than we would act, and I am able to come to terms with these fae being very primal and very animalistic type creatures, because that's what fae are. Fae are not human, so I can't hold them to the same standards that I would hold myself or that I would hold human characters to, because this is just how they are. That's their culture, so I can dislike it all I want to. I can be uncomfortable with those scenes and I can call it out for being that way. However, is it relevant to the story? Is it relevant to that world? I would say the answer is yes. And so this is something that I apply a lot to high fantasy books, anything that's set in a different world that's not Earth. A lot of times the characters, especially if they are something like vampires or fae, they aren't human, so I can't judge them by human standards. Their morality and their way of living is going to be completely different than what mine is. In A Court of Thorns and Roses, the observer character is Feyre because she is the human that has been thrust into this fae world. So although these fae are really primal and animalistic, she can look at them and be like, hold up, that's not okay with me. She actually fights back, she holds grudges, and that was enough for me to be like, okay, we've got some balance to this situation here. I'm not supposed to just read this and completely write everything off and overlook it like, oh, well, that's okay. This observer character does allow the reader to have a little bit of judgment there. So I do try to really examine what the time period and what the culture of these worlds that I'm reading about are like, and is that accurate within their world? Do I have a right to judge them? I can dislike them all day long, I can frown upon it, I can point it out, I can make GOODREADS statuses and tweets saying, wow, this really sucks, I hate this in this book, but is it culturally relevant in that story? That's something that I am challenging myself to look at better as a reader, so I just kind of wanted to get my thoughts out about it and just tell you guys how I am thinking about the books that I read. While I appreciate cultural relativism, I don't read fiction books for a totally 100% accurate account because it's fiction after all. It's not nonfiction. So as you can see, I flip-flop on what I look for in books, but I still just wanted to talk about it because it's been on my mind lately with like 4 books that I've read recently, and I just am thinking like, how does my mind like would judge a book by something and then the next book I'm like, oh, well, it's okay. So it's been really interesting to me to see my ratings of books and like what I hold against one book, I may not hold it against another book, and that's okay. We are allowed to do that as readers because we are individuals, and I reserve the right to think whatever I want to think about a book, and you guys do too, definitely. So it just may not be working for me in one book, but in another one, maybe it presented it in a way that spoke to me personally. So yeah, I don't know, I don't have a point I'm trying to make. I just wanted to kind of talk through some of my feelings on some of the books I've been reading recently. I would definitely love to hear what you guys think on this topic. Let me know your experiences with historical fiction or with fantasy worlds. Do you ever see constructs of these societies that are completely opposite of ours, and how do you handle that as a reader? Do you think about it in terms of cultural relativism? It's a discussion, so I will definitely be around in the comments as much as I can be. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the comments. Bye!